Hey friends, before we get started, I'd really appreciate it if you could subscribe, like, and leave a comment. It would help the video out a lot, and it's an easy thing for you to do but means a lot to us. Thanks in advance. So, during a long drive, I found myself alone, having to stop in a remote village in the middle of nowhere. My car was acting up, and I had no choice but to pull over hearse. I thought I'd do my best to manage, then make my way to the city where I could get it properly fixed. It was already evening, and the sun was dipping low on the horizon, signaling that night was approaching. As I drove into the village, I noticed several rundown houses, old and weathered by time. Nearby, a man around 50, wearing a checkered shirt and gray, dirt-stained pants, was watching me with a look of irritation and distrust. I stepped out of the car. The man stood up and walked over. "You need to leave here," he said as he approached. "Why?" I asked, caught off guard. "Just go. That's all." "I would if I could, but my car isn't in great shape," I explained, gesturing toward it. "It's almost sunset, and I really don't want to be stranded out here at night. There's nowhere else nearby, so I had no choice but to stop here. I'll just spend the night, fix the car, and be on my way." He looked me up and down, judging silently before asking, "Where do you plan on sleeping?" "In my car," I replied. "Absolutely not." Shaking his head, he replied, "Since it's come to this, there's an empty house here where you can stay the night. Tomorrow, you can fix up your car and leave. I don't think sleeping in your car is wise." I started to refuse, but he insisted, "Really, it's for the best," and then added, "All right, my people will help you." He headed towards his house. "Wait here. I'll be right back," he said. He went inside, and I waited outside. A minute later, he returned with a set of keys. "Let's go," he said, gesturing for me to follow him. Deciding not to argue, I went along. We walked deep into the village, past a few houses along the street, then took a left, moving past several more. Near one house, I saw a woman around 40, standing stock still, her eyes wide open, staring at us as we walked by, not once looking away. Quietly, I asked the man, "What's wrong with her?" "Don't look at her," he said, keeping his gaze straight ahead, "and don't speak to her or anyone else you might see like her." "Like what?" I asked, surprised. "Strange," was his only reply. "All right," I murmured. A couple more houses later, we reached our destination, an old wooden house surrounded by a low wooden fence you could easily step over. "Well, here we are," he said, unlocking the front door. He handed me the keys, adding, "Make sure to lock the door and don't go outside at night." "Okay, thanks," I replied. "No problem. Take care," he said before leaving me alone in the house. I checked the kitchen cabinets, finding only dusty dishes. I looked through the nightstand and found a few old books and magazines, and inside the closet there was a clutter of random items. I locked the front door with the key and bolted it before heading to bed. It was already dark outside, and I was exhausted, so I fell asleep quickly. I woke up the next morning to sunlight streaming through the curtains. Not wanting to waste any time, I got ready and headed out to the car. As I walked down the street, retracing my steps from the day before, I saw an elderly woman and a man standing by one of the houses, looking down at something on the ground. There was a frail old man and a skinny old lady lying there, and I couldn't quite make out what was happening because they were blocking my view. As I walked closer, I overheard part of their conversation. The woman said, "Mikhail's heart was too weak. Looks like he couldn't handle it." The man replied, "Now he'll come to take him and bring him back." But as he spoke, he noticed me and fell silent, turning away with the old lady. It was then that I noticed the old man lying face down on the grass, a large mole on his left cheek. Wide-eyed, I stared, unable to look away. The elderly man by the woman looked at me and asked, "What are you doing here? Where did you come from?" I explained that my car had broken down, and I'd stopped here for the night to repair it in the morning. "What a hassle for you," the old lady shook her head. "Be careful, kid," the old man said. "Good luck," I replied, continuing down the street. Soon I reached my car and headed over to it, only to find that every single tire had been slashed, not just punctured, but deeply slashed. Frustrated and angry, I cursed under my breath and headed back to the man's house. I knocked on the door and waited. A moment later, he came out holding a mug of tea, looking at me in the same clothes he wore yesterday. "Is your car fixed?" he asked. I explained that my tires were cut and I couldn't leave. I asked if he'd seen anyone around. "What the hell?" he muttered sympathetically, inviting me inside. How could this happen? We went inside and sat on an old couch. "Did anyone see who did this?" I asked. "By the way, what's your name?" He simply replied, "Grisha. Why are you so eager to find someone to blame? Maybe you should be asking what to do now." I sighed, saying, "What else can I do? I have no idea." He took a sip of tea and said, "If I were you, I'd walk to the city. It's about 80 kilometers from here. If you walk fast and don't stop, you could make it in a day." I stared at him, dumbfounded. "Are you serious? Walk all day just to reach the city? That's absurd." Grisha shrugged. "Well, there's another option. Witty, a local supply guy, should be passing through in 2 days. Bring your clothes and anything you need. He'll drive you back to the city and you can get help from there. Honestly, I prefer that plan. Just stay low until then. You don't want to attract too much attention." I asked him, "Why are you so concerned?" "You'll understand eventually, but for now, just go back and relax. There should be some books lying around." He gave me a firm look, adding, "And seriously, don't go out at night. Go hang out over there," Grisha said. And seeing my unhappy look, he added, "I'm serious. It's for your own safety. Don't talk to anyone, and don't go out at night." "I'll try," I replied, and after leaving his place, I headed back home. When I got to the spot where my grandpa died, I noticed that besides those 2 people, there were now 3 more. 2 old ladies and another grandpa. As I walked by, one of the old ladies turned around, and so did the grandpa. They both stared at me, wide-eyed, while the others didn't seem to notice. I kept staring at the bodies, and after moving a good distance away, I turned around for a second and saw those 2 still looking at me. I hurried home, went inside, and locked the door, then sat on the bed. I started thinking about why everyone else was just standing around those bodies, trying to ignore it. After a while, I went to the window and got really scared. Those 2 old guys I saw earlier were still there, and now that woman I saw yesterday was with them too. They were all just standing there, staring at me with their eyes wide open. I looked at them for a couple of minutes and noticed they weren't moving at all, which really freaked me out. Then I remembered the old guys talking about my grandpa's body, saying he'd take it and bring it back. What did that even mean? I started to worry a lot. I spent the next couple of hours trying to figure out what was going on, but I couldn't make sense of anything. So I went back to the window, and there was no one on the road anymore. That really got to me. Returning to the empty house, I tried to read, but the events of the day kept replaying in my mind. Later that night, as darkness blanketed the village, strange noises broke the silence. Heavy footsteps, slow and deliberate, echoed from outside, accompanied by the unmistakable sound of chains clinking. I quietly approached the window, peering through a small gap in the curtains. In the dim light, I could just make out a broad-shouldered man in a black cloak, moving at a painstakingly slow pace. Each step he took was synchronized with the sound of those chains. He seemed to be dragging something. As he drew closer, I saw that he was holding what looked like the body of the old man from the morning, gripping either his neck or hair, dragging him across the ground. I stared, heart pounding, as my mind tried to rationalize what I was seeing. The only logical explanation was that he must be some sort of gravedigger come to collect the body. He had thick, messy hair and a cloak that dragged on the ground, so long you could see it even from here in the dark. In his hand, he was gripping either someone's neck or their hair, dragging someone along the ground. I figured it was probably the corpse of that old man who died yesterday. I was staring in shock as he pulled it, trying to wrap my head around what it could mean. The most logical conclusion was that he was the local gravedigger, and he had only come now because he wasn't in the village during the day. The talk about bringing the body back probably meant he would handle all the necessary arrangements. But the unease in my gut refused to settle. As I watched, he disappeared into the darkness, fading from view. I lingered by the window, barely breathing, hoping the night would pass without further incident. Then, just as I was about to move away, another figure appeared on the street. This one had unnaturally long arms swinging low, almost brushing the ground. His walk was jerky and unsettling, and shockingly it looked as though he had two heads, each facing different directions. At first, I thought it might be some sort of costume, but the longer I watched, the clearer it became. Each head turned independently. Shaken, I wondered why anyone in this village would dress like that at night. Reluctantly, I tore myself away from the window, deciding I'd rather not look at anything else outside. I lay in bed, tossing and turning as the strange sights replayed in my mind. Eventually, exhaustion won out, and I drifted into a restless sleep. The next morning, I was determined to talk to Grisha and get answers. As I stepped outside, I noticed a figure swaying by the neighboring house, his back turned to me. When he finally turned around, I realized it was the same old man with the mole on his left cheek. He was staring at me with wide eyes, and after a few moments, a slow, unsettling smile spread across his face, turning into a disturbing grin. There's a guy standing by the neighbor's house, swaying back and forth with his back to me, not wanting to see what I was up to. I was on my way down the road when I heard him turn around, and it turned out to be that old man with a mole on his left cheek. He was staring at me wide-eyed, a bit shaken by the surprise. I stopped and was just standing there, probably with the same wide-eyed look. After a couple of seconds, a slow smile spread across his face, which soon turned into a big grin, and I quickly went where I wanted, constantly glancing back at him to make sure he was still standing there, smiling at me. When I turned the corner, I picked up my pace even more. No one else crossed my path, and I got home calmly. 2 minutes later, after I knocked, Grisha opened the door. He saw my expression and asked what was wrong. I wanted to say it firmly, but it came out sounding really pitiful. I want to know what's going on. What's serious? A smirk appeared on his face. I'm not joking. What the hell is going on here? All right, come in, he replied after a half-minute pause, and we went into the house together and sat on the couch. What do you want to know? He finally asked. Everything, I replied, feeling the weight of unease settle over me. He sighed, then began, There's a creature we call the Collector of Bodies. He only comes at night, dragging his chains. Whenever someone dies in the village, he finds the body, no matter where it's hidden, and by the next day, you'll likely see that person alive again. He hesitated, then continued, but they don't come back the same. I listened in silence as Grisha described the reanimated villagers. They return with vacant eyes, unnatural movements, and sometimes even aggression. Wiping his forehead, he went on, Over time, the people here have changed. There are fewer and fewer normal folks left. But it's not just that he resurrects them, he added. Sometimes he even stitches parts together. Horrified, I asked, You mean he creates monsters? Grisha nodded solemnly, explaining that these creatures only come out at night, lurking in the shadows, always aggressive and unpredictable. "That's why I warned you not to go outside after dark," he said, looking me in the eyes. We continued talking as dusk began to settle outside. Realizing the time, Grisha urged me to leave before the night fully descended. I returned to the house, the eerie silence outside amplifying my sense of dread. Pulling the curtains tightly shut, I checked the locks multiple times, hoping it would be enough to keep whatever lurked outside at bay. Trying to sleep was futile. Every creak and whisper of the wind made me jump. Around midnight, a distant scream sliced through the silence, a sound that was almost inhuman. I lay frozen, praying for morning. As dawn finally broke, I dragged myself out of bed, bleary-eyed and anxious to talk to Grisha again. The night's terror still weighed heavily on me, and I needed answers, any answers that might help me understand what I was facing. I walked down the street toward Grisha's house, feeling the eyes of villagers following my every step. About 5 people stood in clusters, each staring at me with unsettling smiles, as if they were in on some disturbing secret. I quickened my pace, knocking on Grisha's door. But there was no response. I knocked again and again, my fists pounding louder each time, but the door remained closed. After about 15 minutes of knocking with no answer, frustration and unease took hold. Where could he be? I wondered aloud, glancing around. Going back to the house I'd stayed in didn't seem appealing. I'd have to pass by those strange villagers again, and the thought made my skin crawl. So I kept knocking, hoping he might return. As the sky dimmed and the sun began to set, an old voice from behind startled me. "You're making a mistake," the voice warned, soft but chilling. I spun around to see a short, elderly man swaying slightly, looking at me with a knowing smile. "Where is he?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. The old man chuckled. "He's gone. There are no more people left in this village." Suddenly, laughter erupted from all sides of the street. I looked around in horror, realizing that there were dozens of people gathered, each wearing the same slow, eerie grin. Panic seized me, and I turned and ran, tearing down the street as fast as my legs could carry me. My only thought was to escape this nightmare of a village. The road stretched before me, leading to open fields where I could leave everything behind. As I sprinted, I heard the rumble of an engine behind me. Desperate, I looked over my shoulder and saw the headlights of a truck coming down the road. Vitya, I thought, a glimmer of hope rising. I began running toward the truck, waving my arms, but then I saw something that stopped me cold. In the truck's glow, a massive figure appeared, a cloaked man dragging chains moving slowly toward the vehicle. My heart sank as I watched the scene unfold. The truck came to a stop, and a man got out, stumbling slightly as he walked toward the figure. "I've arrived," he stammered, his voice shaky. The man in the cloak opened the truck door, and bodies, several of them, tumbled out onto the ground. "Vitya, is that you?" a villager called out, stepping forward into the darkness. But before he could say more, the cloaked figure reached down, grabbing one of the bodies with a massive hand. A chilling scream pierced the night as the corpse began thrashing, coming to life with a horrifying, jerking movement. In one swift motion, the figure tossed the reanimated corpse at the approaching villager. The man screamed as the undead being landed on him, biting into his flesh. From the shadows, another creature emerged, a twisted figure with limbs bent at unnatural angles, sniffing the air as if searching for prey. Several more figures lurked nearby, vaguely human but grotesquely distorted. Overwhelmed by fear, I crouched low, praying they hadn't seen me. Slowly, I began crawling backward, careful not to make a sound. When I was far enough away, I got to my feet and ran with everything I had, leaving the cursed village behind. I sprinted through fields of tall grass, not daring to look back, but after about an hour of running, exhaustion set in. I tripped over something and fell hard, hitting my head against a rock. The world went dark. When I regained consciousness, the sky was just beginning to lighten, signaling dawn. I sat up, disoriented and in pain, my head throbbing where I'd hit it. As I looked around, struggling to remember where I was, I noticed a figure in the distance, wearing tall boots and a large backpack. With my legs shaking, I rose to my feet, hoping that this stranger might help me. I staggered toward him, my heart pounding with a mix of fear and hope. As I got closer, I noticed he was walking toward me, his face shrouded in shadows. Relief flooded me, and despite everything, I felt a strange, uncontrollable urge to laugh. I stopped, staring at him as he continued to approach. There was something about his eyes that held me, a look of terror mixed with confusion as he realized the state I was in. I couldn't pull my gaze away. My thoughts were muddled, fragments coming and going in an endless loop, and I nearly forgot what I'd just been thinking. Noticing the wound on my head, which was somehow stitched up, felt almost irrelevant. The only thing I could focus on was his horrified expression as I moved closer. Slowly, a grin spread across my face, and then, without reason, I laughed, a hollow, broken laugh that echoed in the early morning light.